Okay, welcome. This meeting is being video recorded to make available on YouTube to others who cannot join us. And I've gotten responses from numerous people that they do want to be able to see our video recording. So to honor our speaker, as well as those of you who are able to join us on time, we're starting this meeting promptly, as announced previously. We'll add others as they come online. So this is a meeting of the Puget Sound Passport Rotary Club, joined by friends from Kiwanis, Lions, Optimist, and other local organizations who share our dedication to community service. We're also collaborating with our friends from the Seattle-King County League of Women Voters, so we welcome their members as well. This program was originally intended for May 8th. Puget Sound Passport Rotary is now becoming a digital club, which allows us to schedule speakers and topics virtually whenever we wish. So with that as introduction, let's get right to it. Our speaker this noon is the former president and CEO of the Federal Home Loan Bank of Chicago, Matt Feldman of Evanston, Illinois. Matt is deeply involved in supporting the municipal philanthropic work that led Evanston to become the first city in the U.S. to pay reparations to its Black citizens. He is regularly called upon to advise local reparations efforts in communities across the United States, with a particular focus on how best to support reparations. Matt also serves on several corporate and philanthropic boards, including the Everett Community Foundation. So his topic this noon is, do you know someone who owes reparations? He's promised to give you ample time for questions when he's finished. So I'll ask you all to please mute your microphones until he's done, and help me welcome to our Passport Rotary Club microphone, Matt Feldman.
Thank you, David. I very much appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to speak to you all today. Many of you, particularly the Rotarians, are familiar with Evanston, Illinois, because, of course, we're the home of Rotary International. But I'm going to speak to another aspect of Evanston that you may not be familiar with, and the implications of that. And many of you, in fact, I'm sure all of you, have read articles at some point about reparations. There's been a lot in the press over the last 10 years about various forms of reparations. And if you go back even further, in the United States, there's the reparations for the internment of the Japanese, and Jewish reparations paid by the Germans, both to survivors of the Holocaust and to the state of Israel. My focus is on Black reparations. This is not because I don't believe that other groups have been harmed and might also merit other forms of repair, but it's because that is where the focus has been in Evanston, because that's where we could document the most immediate and pervasive harm. With that, I thought it might be useful to talk a little bit about what reparations are, because reparations are quite a bit more than just payments to individuals, which is generally where people begin and end a conversation. In fact, I've had many conversations that ended based entirely on the assumption that that was the only thing that was meant by reparations. I want to start with the United Nations key components for reparations, and they're global components. This is not necessarily just about the United States or the kinds of reparations that might impact the African diaspora, whether in the United States or anywhere else in the world. But it sets a very high bar. And so I want to talk about that for a moment, and then we'll go to where I really have some experience to discuss, which is local reparations. So there are 5 components to the United Nations recommendations. The first one, which actually is a very high bar, is restitution. If you think about that in the context of what has arisen in the United States first with the international transport of Africans from the African coast to the United States in the form of slavery, to the domestic slave trade, to Jim Crow, to various forms of segregation and denial of rights over the years. Restitution, as the UN defines it, is a very difficult task. But then there is some form of compensation, and they look at compensation as economically assessing damages. If you took those two alone and looked at the United States, the amounts are quite overwhelming, and the effort is so large as it often turns people off to even have the discussion, which is not the point. It's to set a standard, but not necessarily try to achieve the entirety of it at one fell swoop. Rehabilitation addresses medical and psychological care, as well as legal and social services. Satisfaction, which is where a lot of local reparations efforts end up, are involved with acknowledging the harm in the first place, and the complicity that various organizations or institutions have in creating the harm. A public apology can be part of that. Commemorations and tributes to victims, museums and memorials. And then, of course, the guarantee of non-repetition. Well, you know, one could argue that if you haven't restored, it's very difficult to guarantee non-repetition. So there are lots of complexities here that go well beyond what any local area can possibly achieve when they think about reparations, but it is certainly a worthy place to start. But reparations are first and foremost about repair, and it's not just repair to those who have been harmed, it's to the community itself. There are legacies in many communities in this country that have left classes of citizens as underserved relative to the rest of the community. And there's a great deal of harm in that to the community. That's both moral and ethical harm, and real harm to the people who are not being properly given the opportunity to enjoy the rights of citizenship the way others can. So the first thing that needs to happen is to focus on the harm in a community. And every community is different, and I'm not going to try to dictate how you think of your communities, but if you look at the experience of Black Americans in your community, you can begin to assess at least the currency of the harm and some of the nature. But municipalities in particular must be able to document their complicity in the harm in order to be able to do anything, because invariably it involves the utilization of tax revenues, and you can't just redirect tax revenues to a specific group just on a whim. It has to be done with some level of documentation. And while this in terms of Black slavery is grounded in history, it is not historical in the harm, because it continues to today and is documented in any number of different ways. And when you think about the degree in which the harm might be identified, I'll just give you a couple of examples. On average in the United States, a typical net worth of a white family is 10 times the level of that of a Black family. And there are significant inheritance problems associated with a Black family actually even achieving wealth transfer over generations. The Urban Institute analyzed that there was a housing finance gap in home ownership, and that there's a 30% difference in home ownership between Black and white families. The University of Michigan has, for many years, documented health disparities in Black and white Americans, and this is all before the pandemic, where it became even more exacerbated. And of course, we've seen lots of articles and news stories about disparate treatment under the law, access to education or job opportunities. But there's also a huge benefit that is rarely talked about outside the business community, which I find fascinating. And one of the most articulate studies I've seen is one that was done by McKinsey and Company that said, if we could actually deal with the racial equity gap in the United States, not a small task, we could expect a rise in GDP of 4 to 6% annually, which is a very significant improvement relative to what we might otherwise experience if we continue to hold back a population from achieving what could be their best achievement in the United States. So the facts support enormous differences here. And the problem, of course, is the scale of what should happen, as noted by the United Nations principles, actually diminishes the perceived value of what can happen. So when a municipality or an institution reaches out and tries to do something to begin the act of repair, it is often viewed as de minimis and therefore ineffectual, which is actually the opposite of what I said previously, that what needs to happen theoretically is so enormous that people dismiss it because of its enormity. So we're caught between what is a very small act of attempting to repair versus the enormity of what would take to create a total repair. And part of the problem, of course, is it's a human rights issue, but it needs to be addressed through a political process. It's impossible for this to be done simply through philanthropy or other acts of individual or institutional contributions. And another problem, and we've seen this in Evanston, is being first requires a vision and commitment and quite a bit of bravery, because people criticize from any side. The Black community may not be satisfied with what a particular municipality does. That certainly happened in Evanston. And an ongoing dialogue has caused a continued growth in the thinking around how that's going to be done. And of course, there are a lot of people who just react negatively to reparations in general and believe that an act that was grounded in slavery somehow has been around too long to be addressed, even though the need for redress of some form should be obvious if you look in any community. There's a wonderful little quote by a religious leader from many years ago who said, "A little bit of light dispels a lot of darkness." And we've seen in Evanston with what we've begun to do, and we're only at the very beginning stages, that what was expected by the Black community was nothing. And what we did was something. It's not perfect. It's not over, because this is evolving, and I'll try to explain how it's evolving. But the effort to do it has had a significant impact, not just on the Black community, but on the Evanston community as a whole. And of course, many of us, and I'm involved both in the philanthropic and the religious side of reparations in the city of Evanston, as well as supporting the city. It is a secular, moral, and religious obligation to support repair for, as I said, the good of the entire society, not just the community we're attempting to provide repair to. So there are many types of local reparations, and you'll see when I get to Evanston how these play out here. But first and foremost is an acknowledgement and a documentation of harm, and quite frankly, an apology. And getting there is actually quite difficult, and that sometimes starts with a commission or a task force to evaluate whether there has been harm, what the harm has been, the extent of the harm, and how best to go about acts of repair. There are some very notable actions going on right now. A commission just rendered its very large results, and I don't mean the dollars, I mean the comprehensiveness for the state of California, for example. But again, these are recommendations that, again, need to be considered. Compensation of some form or economic programs that provide benefits or support are a part of it. As I said before, memorials and museums and other ways of acknowledging past problems and even current problems that were where the municipality or people or organizations in the municipality were complicit. The restoration of neighborhoods. There have been a couple of instances where local municipalities have concluded that they destroyed a Black neighborhood by creating a highway and running it through the neighborhood, or in otherwise degrading the life in that neighborhood, locating pollution-causing plants there, environmental hazards, and programs that focus on the origin and local nature of the harm in order to support the people who were locally harmed. Recognizing that local reparations, even though this sounds like a lot to achieve, are considerably easier to get your head around than national reparations, which requires a much greater act of political, of legislation. So I'm going to use Evanston as the example. Not surprisingly, Evanston has the same kind of disparity in wealth and income that is true in the rest of the United States. Part of what drives that is redlining, and the city did a masterful job of identifying where it was actually complicit in harm, and I'll get to that in a moment. But if you look at the pink area is the principal Black district in Evanston, and it was redlined into, quote, undesirable back in the 1930s, and it is where most of the Black residents still live today. And there were things that were done to that also degraded that neighborhood. And there were ways in which people Black people who lived outside that neighborhood were actually forced to either buy something in the neighborhood, have their house moved into the neighborhood, or move out of Evanston entirely. This is a time that one of the major donors in Evanston likes to refer to as the Jim Crow era in Evanston. So there are three components now to Evanston reparations. The first was municipal action, then contributions to repair, and the faith community has played and continues to play an enormous role. So municipal action, there were two city council resolutions in 2019. The first one was a commitment to end structural racism and achieve racial equity, which is, as I said before, a very big lift, but at least it was committed to. And then the second established the Evanston Reparations Fund. This is a tax-funded fund, and allocated $10 million in tax revenues to it. They did this based on what is now called a harm report, which at the time there was no such thing. This was a document that was already developed in large part by a wonderful organization here called Shorefront Legacy that had spent literally years documenting the life of Black people in Evanston and on the North Shore of Chicago. And so they turned around this requested report to the city in 2 weeks because they had most of it done. And of course, the biggest thing they were able to document that the city was complicit in was redlining, and therefore the denial of wealth creation at the same levels that was provided to white residents of Evanston. The Reparations Committee of the City Council selected the first residents to receive reparations under what is a restorative housing program. That's a $25,000 voucher program to purchase, rehab, or refinance a home based on individuals who had lived in Evanston and had been denied housing access directly related to city actions between 1919 and 1969. As you might expect, the 100+ people, almost 125 people in that group are quite old, and therefore they wanted to act on their issues first, and they began issuing housing vouchers. Two things have happened since then. One is the city allocated an additional $10 million to the reparations. Again, this is to be paid over 10 years. And the city expanded the program to provide cash payments for eligible recipients who rent and don't own. And this is because, as I said before, in some cases, people were denied the opportunity to own or continue to own a home. And the only way they could stay in Evanston was to rent. So they'd been renting for many years. They're elderly. They had no descendants they could pass the benefit to. And so they are going to be provided a cash payment. So that is the city's program, at least in summary. The contributions were based on an understanding that, quite frankly, even at the time, 10 million or 20 million would never be sufficient to close the gap. And so an organization that was in formation at the time called the Reparations Stakeholders Authority of Evanston, which is a board drawn from the Black community, approached the Evanston Community Foundation, and I'm on the board and the treasurer of the foundation, to create a fund under our aegis that is called the Evanston Reparations Community Fund. And the Evanston Community Foundation seeded that, has provided some operating grants to the Reparations Stakeholders Authority of Evanston, and a lot of advice. We meet all the time with them in order to help them continue to build the endowment on that fund, and to work through a process of board structure and administration, and how they solicit community feedback in order to distribute the funds. Finally, several local institutions, including mine, established lay support groups for reparations and began sharing our knowledge across the community. And this was not bounded by any particular religious faith. It just happened that a whole bunch of us discovered that we were all interested in providing some level of not only moral but religious support, as well as contributions to repair. That led to something called the Interfaith Clergy and Leaders of Evanston, publicly announcing a commitment of 18 faith institutions to educate our membership, support HR 40 or other legislation or executive action nationally, raise money for the fund, and begin a process of reconciliation and repair. And in our first year, we raised close to $1 million from those 18 institutions for the Evanston Reparations Community Fund. The number of institutions is growing. We got lots of room. Evanston has 93 faith institutions. This is 18 of us. So when I say this is the beginning of a process, it is truly that. There are over 400 acts of repair in the United States today, ranging from removing Confederate memorials to putting up memorials to what happened to Black people as they were enslaved and auctioned, their experiences in the country, in particular municipalities, or, as I said before, actual community repair in various forms. It is likely that one or more initiatives are happening near where you live. I don't happen to have lists of them at the moment, but I'm happy to help you research. But I've listed a couple of examples there that, again, fall along the context of where the harm may have been caused. So how can you support reparations in your community if you choose to do so? First thing you need to do is find the local leaders who are actually moving reparations forward. Reparations is, even though the Black Americans are the people being harmed, they're also the driver of the reparations movement, and they should be. People like me who are heavily involved and engaged, we're the supporters. And I've had wonderful opportunity because of where I live to get engaged in ways that were both domestic and international that I never ever expected when I retired from being a banker. But I found ways in which I could provide support by listening to, educating myself, and then asking how I could be helpful. And sometimes the answers are not exactly what you expect, but if you can contribute in a meaningful way, you do. Then you share what you know with everybody else, right? And that actually used to be very awkward, and it's now reached the point where almost everybody I know asks me what's going on with reparations when I see them. So my wife has a point in every conversation where she steps back and tolerates me for some period of time while I explain the latest things that are going on. Seek opportunities to create educational programs. We've created a number of them. We've shared them across the faith communities and in the secular community. and there are others who are doing the same. It's become a very rich environment here, mostly around adult education, and I think that's very beneficial. We advocate. We obviously promote local reparations through all opportunities, including conversations like this. As I said before, we do contribute. I'm a contributor, and many of the people in my religious institution are but I also contribute my time and my network. As a former banker, I helped the city line up the institutions that would handle the refinancing or the purchases and take the vouchers, the reparations vouchers, as part of the down payment. You can make financial contributions. And of course, as I said before, you really have to follow what the reparations leaders are looking for. And you'll find that there are things that go on that are educational to you because you've just never, ever had the exposure that you should to understand how these issues arise in the first place and just how deeply the harm is and how frequent and currently it is occurring. To me, that's one of the most important things that has happened with me. And, we do this, quite frankly, because we believe it's morally and ethically necessary and to improve our communities. I said this before, this is not just about helping the Black community. These kinds of inequities are a cancer within a community, and they're damaging to the whole community, not just the people being harmed. And quite frankly, because we want to be on the right side of history. And with that, David, I'm happy to turn it over to questions.
Okay, so thanks very much, Matt. And let's see, we're going to unshare the screen. Okay, that's great. So remember the concept that used to be known as equal time. It's not enforced much anymore on television, but we're going to do our best to implement it here with the idea of giving both sides an opportunity to ask questions. If you have a question now for Matt, just click the reactions tab in the lower right corner of your screen and then click raise your hand. In addition, this program has raised some controversy, at least among Rotarians. So to help achieve the principle of fairness to all concerned, we'll also ask you to indicate in your reaction either yes if you support Matt's idea or no if you oppose it. And if you don't have an opinion yet, you can just leave that blank. In the spirit of first come, first served, we'll do our best to call on you in order, working back and forth between yeses and nos. And finally, I ask that we not have any speeches, just ask a question. That allows more people to ask questions and for more information to get out. So our first question this noon comes from Heather Kelly, the president of the Seattle-King County League of Women Voters. Heather wants to know what individual or group should get to decide the question of whether reparations are owed. Matt?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And the answer is going to be different in each community. I can tell you what happened in Evanston. It began with the city council and a debate in the city council and a decision, a unanimous decision by the city council that some form of reparations was owed. That in many ways caused the rest of us to sit up and take notice and try to understand not just the rationale, but what role we should play. I'll give you an example. When the Reparations Stakeholders Authority of Evanston came to the Evanston Community Foundation and said, we'd like you to form a fund, many of us on the board felt that part of our contribution to repair should be to not charge anything for the investment or the administration of the fund. And we had quite a bit of discussion at the board before we concluded that indeed that was what we were going to do. And as the treasurer, I put a major proviso on it that said, so long as the fund isn't larger than the foundation, we will continue this practice. But if it gets larger than the foundation, then what we want to do is at least have a discussion about how much we can afford, because otherwise we might not be able to support them. At least fortunately for us at the moment, that's not the case. And the interactions between the foundation and the fund have been really informative to not just them in formation, but for those of us who meet with them monthly to try to understand what they're doing and how we can help. It's educated us in ways that none of us would have ever anticipated.
Okay, next with his hand up is Jeff Worthen. What organization are you from, Jeff?
Hi, David. I'm president of the University District Rotary Club here in
Okay.
Seattle. And I do support reparations in some form. My question for Matt is, and you pointed out that you are in Evanston, and that is where Rotary is. What support or lack of support has the city of Evanston and the related organizations received from Rotary International?
I can't give you the complete picture there. I can only give you what I know, which is it hasn't been direct support, but I don't know that we've solicited any. So I'm not aware of the city's attempt to solicit support from Rotary International. And certainly, given that my engagement has been with the Evanston Community Foundation, which, by the way, is in the Rotary building. So there is some support, at least at the floor level, if you will. With Beth Emmet Synagogue, which happens to be my religious institution, and we have Rotarians who are members of Beth Emmet, and we had a Rotarian who was on the board of the Evanston Community Foundation at the time that we authorized the fund, and actually a very meaningful position. She's the chief operating officer of Rotary International. So they're certainly aware of it, but in some ways, the largest institutions in the city and the two largest institutions in the city, two of the three, are Rotary International and Northwestern University, and the third one would be Evanston Northwestern Healthcare, are actually more challenging to engage because they are so large and disparate. So we have professors at Northwestern, we have physicians at Evanston Northwestern Healthcare, and we have Rotarians, but we don't have the organizations, if you will. Does that make sense? Sorry, you're on mute.
Sorry. Yes, it does, Matt. Thank you.
If you can put your hand down then in the same way in reverse. I see that Scott Wands is the president of Lake Forest Park Rotary, and Scott has a question.
Yeah, I think the argument could be made that the southern states are much more complicit in this damage than the state of Illinois. Do you have any sense of whether this idea of reparations is gaining any traction in those states?
Well, let me first challenge the first assumption that you made, which is just that the southern states are more complicit. If you look at, for example, the documentation that's arisen in the last 10 years associated with the National African American Museum at the Smithsonian, the northern states directly benefited from both the transatlantic slave trade and, more importantly, the domestic slave trade. There are major financial institutions that, if not built on money from the transportation and or exploitation of slaves, at least benefited substantially as a result of it. So I think, and even Jim Crow, I mentioned in passing that one of our leading donors came to Evanston in the 70s, which he refers to as the Jim Crow era of Evanston. And I will tell you that that is an accurate description of Evanston, Illinois in the 1970s and even into the 1980s. So overtly discriminatory, and that doesn't count the structural discrimination that goes on today. So beyond that, you'd be surprised. There are local reparations efforts going on in the South. In fact, I was very surprised initially when 3 of the more advanced local reparations efforts are going on in North Carolina. And if you've been to Charleston, South Carolina, for example, they have actually turned the slave auction site into a museum and a memorial. Montgomery, Alabama, of course, has the museum and the memorial to the Equal Justice Initiative that was built by the Equal Justice Initiative. And I might add, my son and future daughter-in-law were involved. So I'm quite knowledgeable about that. And actually, when I was a bank president, I took my board and my executives to Montgomery, Alabama. And when we were there, we found that there were lynchings that took place as far north as Chicago and actually southeastern Minnesota. I had a board member in northern Wisconsin who realized when we were down in Montgomery that a lynching had taken place 5 miles from his home. So they didn't happen as frequently in the North, but they happened in the North. And many times the most violent reactions in the North weren't lynching, they were riots. And many extrajudicial killings of some other form. And they often happen when veterans, Black veterans, came home from fighting America's wars and expected to be treated at least as equally as we were at least fighting for in World War I and World War II. So there's a lot of documentation that suggests that it isn't just a Southern problem. And in fact, that a great deal of the wealth in places like Boston and New York was at least partly based on the kind of trade that brought the slaves to the United States. The Triangle Trade is famously that one of the legs is Boston. And just because, they had the molasses component of it and not the and the rum component and not the slave component doesn't make them any less complicit in the trade.
Thank you for that insight.
Matt, as we wait for others to raise their hands with questions, one of the most frequent questions I get when discussing reparations with anyone is, why am I responsible for the sins of my forebears, sins that I have not committed?
It is a very common question. I hear it all the time. I actually, because I'm Jewish, I hear we weren't even here, right? So you may as well take the last piece of it as well. My grandparents were immigrants. We didn't do this, except that this is today. If this were just about slavery, and that the end of the Civil War and the 14th Amendment completely resolved the issue of the ongoing issues of chattel slavery in the United States, there might be an argument there, and you'd be looking at a level of Black equality that simply doesn't exist in this country. There are all sorts of examples, and it doesn't even have to do with wealth disparities. I have I'm of that age in the Chicago metro area where many of the most successful finance people in Chicago are around my age and sort of came of age with me. And so many of them are also my friends, and they're Black, and they have over the years told stories about the way they've been treated in places like department stores and grocery stores, and by being stopped by the police while driving, or the way they have to educate their children, particularly their sons, about what happens if they get stopped and why they have to be particularly cooperative. All of these things occur today. This is what our society does today. And I'm not suggesting that everybody reach into their pockets and put their own money on the table. You're welcome to do it. I've chosen to do it. but I'm also living in a community that's doing it. So it's not just me alone. There's a large group of us and growing group of us who are doing it because we fundamentally believe that it needs to be done. But what happens in each community is going to be dependent on what the harm is in the community and what the needs are in the community. And there are communities in parts of this country where, the question isn't really about reparations for Black Americans. It's about reparations for Native Americans or for Japanese Americans or Chinese Americans. The question is, what kind of country do we want 50 years from now? Because if we don't start today, we'll have exactly the same kind of country we have now, except that there's going to be a lot more people of color in this country than there are today, because demographics don't lie. I spent a little bit of time living among actuaries as a young banker. And the one thing I learned at that point is if you ignore demographics, you do that at your own risk. It's one of the reasons that we made our bank as diverse as it is, because we recognized if you didn't start early, you'd never get it done. And we needed to be successful 25 years from now, not just sitting on our laurels today. And the country is changing. And are we going to at least deal with it, or are we going to wait until it deals with us?
Okay, other questions? Larry? No? Larry Granite? Jeff Pritchard? Catherine Carboni Rogers? Got a question, pal? You're muted, Catherine.
I'm on my phone, and so I'm having trouble navigating, so I apologize, but
You're doing just fine.
I don't have a question as much as a comment. I just want to commend the Evanston community for doing this work. It's a huge encouragement to me because as a leader in Highline School District, which is in one of the most progressive communities in our state, probably, we are having a group of people that are attacking us for doing anything that has to do with equity. And so I've been feeling discouraged, and this is really uplifting to me. So thank you. Thank you for leading the way.
Don't be discouraged. If you start with, this is a human rights issue, and human rights should not be political, then people will attack you. I've spent enough time doing this now to know that not every audience I visit with is sitting there going, "Oh, thank God! Really glad you're talking about this. This is really terrific. I've been thinking this all along." On the other hand, it's the rare audience that can completely deny the existence of profound inequality. They may say, too difficult to deal with. They may say, not my problem. They may say there really is no fix, which suggest they have no agency at all, not just in the issue of reparations, but essentially in their own lives. But those of us who think we do believe that while we stand on this earth, we should actually do something that matters, even if the results that we're looking for won't occur in my lifetime. And I'm reasonably confident that the results will not occur in my lifetime. But if, and we have a son getting married in 3 weeks, so if I have grandchildren, I would like them to be, to at least know that I was on this and focused on it in a way that was not casual and was attempting to do things meaningful. And quite frankly, even in the few years I've been doing it, I've seen some pretty significant change. So, politics change all the time, whether you like them or not. It's been said, and it's certainly been true, elections have consequences. And people's attitudes change either when the world around them changes and they can no longer deny it, or demographics take hold. And I'm good with that too. I don't have to outlive everyone who is a detractor to ideas around social justice. I just have to know that there are people moving it forward. Before I take any other questions, I did put 3 things in the chat. One is a reparations toolkit that's on the First Repair website. First Repair is now a national nonprofit that is here in Evanston that provides information and support around reparations. The second one is the African American Redress Network redress map. The African American Redress Network is actually a joint venture between Columbia University Law School, Howard University Law School, and the Thurgood Marshall Center. And they track, not completely, or comprehensively, because people have to tell them, but they do track acts of redress around the country, and they have about 400 of them now. And then I have my email address in case somebody wants to follow up.
Okay, anybody else have any questions? Okay, so as he's told us, Matt comes from champion of reparations to Black Americans in the Chicago area. The idea for this program actually originally occurred to me when I saw a prominent American say that he doubted whether Native Americans who had been welcomed by the Pilgrims at the first Thanksgiving might not have viewed Thanksgiving as much of an event for celebration after innumerable treaty violations. So after conversations with some friends, Texas Rotarians, by the way, I was reminded that the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was signed into law by President Nixon in December of 1971 and constituted at that time the largest land claim settlement in U.S. history. That, of course, act was passed by Congress and was intended to solve long-standing issues surrounding Aboriginal land claims in Alaska, as Wikipedia so inartfully describes it. So besides Native Americans, there's the long history of racism against Asian Americans, as in the Chinese Exclusion Act that suspended immigration from China for 10 years, and Pacific Islanders. Just yesterday, a friend of mine suggested that the descendants of Jewish survivors of the Holocaust might be added as well. And of course, there are probably others. What I'd say to you is that some of these American citizens have been waiting for decades for us to start these talks. Our intent is not to achieve perfection, nor to commit you to making reparations to anyone. All we want to do is to raise an issue of significant public policy and probably some controversy to the attention of our community, as has been done in Evanston, Illinois. Maybe it's an issue that you should be discussing in your Rotary Club or in your Kiwanis Club or in your Chamber of Commerce or elsewhere. We've already had a request for Matt to address the Rotary Club of Duval next week, I think, right, Matt?
I think so. I haven't heard back yet as to get a confirmation, but
Yeah.
I need to follow up with him.
So yesterday, past District Governor Kathy Gibson told me that the district's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee expects to address this issue very soon. I think that's all good and healthy for our communities and most worthwhile. Just be aware that Matt's particular interest is reparations for African Americans. Whether you think it needs to go anywhere else is entirely up to you, the organizations you represent, and your own sense of whether it is fair to all concerned. We've asked Matt to put his contact information in the chat box if you want to reach out to him directly. This program will be available soon on YouTube, maybe as soon as this afternoon, if you wish to view it again, or if you wish to refer it to other friends. You can search for it on YouTube simply by searching for the name Matt Feldman. That's F-E-L-D-M-A-N with one N. And we'll automatically be sending out a link to the program to area Rotarians. But if you'd like to get it too, just put a note in the chat box with your email address on it. So I would say many thanks again to Matt Feldman of Evanston, Illinois. And we'll now be ending this video recording, right?